I come from a tradition of women maroons, cimarrones, who didn't just try to escape from oppression, but were totally mind, body, spirit committed to resisting and committed to winning. Whether was Nanny in Jamaica, who fought against the enslavers, whether it was Harriet Tubman, who helped to free more than 700 slaves. I think I come from a very strong history, and I simply wanted to live on this planet and to continue that tradition and to try in my little way to make my ancestors proud.
Hello, dear listeners, friends, comrades, subjects, citizens, insurgents, fugitives, defectors, dissidents, even the haters and losers. Welcome to Turbulence. My name is Dylan Saba, and I am here as always with our lovely producer, M. Siniza. We are recording from New York City, the center of a world empire that is dying, but so far from dead. On August 29, 1969, a TWA flight carrying 127 passengers departed from Rome, bound for Tel Aviv. Shortly after takeoff, two members of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, Salim Issawi and a 25-year-old woman named Leila Khaled, seized control of the aircraft. Khaled had been born in Haifa in 1944. 4 years later, during the Nakba, she and her family were expelled from their land into Lebanon, where she grew up as a refugee. As a teenager, she joined the Arab nationalist movement, and in late 1967 became a founding-era member of the PFLP. In the course of the operation, Khaled would return to Palestine for the first time since her exile, if only from the air, and only for a moment. Nearing Tel Aviv, Khaled instructed the pilot to divert the plane north and fly over Haifa. From the cockpit, she looked down on the city from which her family had been expelled 2 decades earlier, the first time she had seen her birthplace since her exile. But the operation had a more concrete political objective. The PFLP believed Israeli officials were aboard the flight and intended to capture them, creating leverage to secure the release of their comrades held in the occupation's prisons. But the officials they were looking for weren't aboard. Instead, Khaled and Issawi redirected the plane to Damascus, where the passengers were evacuated and the militants blew up the nose of the aircraft. 6 days later, and more than 6,000 miles away, another young woman was preparing to take part in another spectacular revolutionary act. On September 4, armed militants stopped the Cadillac carrying U.S. Ambassador Charles Burke Elbrick through the city of Rio de Janeiro. They pulled Elbrick from the car and disappeared with him into the city. The operation was carried out jointly by two organizations fighting Brazil's U.S.-backed military dictatorship, Ação Libertadora Nacional and the group that would become known as the Revolutionary Movement of the 8th of October, or MR8. Named for the date of Che Guevara's capture in Bolivia. At the center of the operation was Vera Silvia Magalhães, a 20-year-old student militant. Magalhães had helped gather the intelligence necessary for the kidnapping, including studying Elbrick's movements and identifying the point where his car could be intercepted. She was the only woman in MR8's Armed Action Section, and the only woman among the operational corps that carried out the ambassador's capture. The militants demanded two things: that Brazil's dictatorship broadcast their revolutionary manifesto to the country, and that it release 15 political prisoners. 4 days later, the government capitulated. The prisoners were flown to Mexico, and Elbrick was released. Within the span of 6 days, women had stood at the center of two spectacular revolutionary operations on opposite sides of the world. It would be tempting to tell their stories as stories of exceptional women who broke into a world of revolutionary militancy otherwise populated by men. But that isn't the real history. Magalhães was hardly the only woman in MR8. The Brazilian dictatorship's own prosecutions identified women throughout the organization: Lucia Murat, Lara Lavelberg, Clea Carapeba Melo, Hezina Maria Toscano Fará, Maria Helena Gimilho Flores Guinle, and others. Among the Brazilian guerrillas was a woman who went by Sonia, who had been imprisoned and tortured by the dictatorship before being freed in a prisoner exchange. And beyond Brazil, the revolutionary struggles of the 20th century were replete with women militants: Jamila Bupacha in Algeria, Celia Sanchez in Cuba, Assata Shakur in the United States, Ruth First in South Africa, and many others whose names did not float to the surface of the historical record. Our guest today, Arlene Eisen, has spent much of her life inside that very history. She became active in the struggle against US imperialism and white supremacy in the 1960s, traveled to Vietnam during the war at the invitation of the Vietnamese Women's Union, and worked alongside revolutionary women from movements around the world. Her latest book, In the Worldwide Family of Militant Women, attempts to recover a history she describes as having been, quote, buried dead without a headstone. But before we turn to the conversation, a note to our listeners. If you want more turbulence, our paid feed is only $5 a month and includes weekly bonus episodes where we break down the week's news, go deeper on topics covered in our interviews, and publish extended conversations with guests. This week, we'll be publishing the second part of our conversation with Mujamma Harakat to the bonus feed, so be on the lookout for that. Turbulence is independent, ad-free, and entirely supported by our listeners. Your subscriptions are what allow us to keep producing this show week after week. And to everyone already contributing, thank you. Hello and welcome. Today we are joined by Arlene Eisen. Arlene has been a militant in the struggle against imperialism and white supremacy since the 1960s and is the author of Women of Vietnam, the report Operation Ghetto Storm, and most recently, The Worldwide Family of Militant Women. Arlene, welcome to Turbulence. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you. It's wonderful to meet you. By the way, the book title is In the Worldwide Family. I don't pretend to be describing the whole family.
Thank you for that correction. In the Worldwide Family of Militant Women, and we are so excited to discuss that work. Arlene, I would love to start by asking you to speak about some of the motivations you had for writing your latest book, In the Worldwide Family of Militant Women, because it's at once a very personal narrative, but it's also a retelling of the story of the New Left and beyond that challenges how we think about the role of women in revolutionary struggles. Women in these movements tend to be remembered either in relation to more famous militant men, often as their romantic partners, or through the repression and the violence that they experienced. But there's a scene in your book when you are meeting with women who are MR8 militants from Brazil living in exile in Paris, where you explicitly reject these two ways of remembering female guerrillas. Can you talk a little bit about that moment and how it connects to the wider frame of your book?
Yes. Of the women you're discussing, the one that I became closest with and worked closest with was a woman who went by the name of Sonia. I never knew her real name. She actually had been in prison and badly tortured and eventually exchanged. In those days, there was a series of kidnappings of rich people and U.S. diplomats by the various guerrilla organizations. And she was one of the people exchanged, let out of prison in exchange for, I'm not sure I ever really knew who she was exchanged for. But anyway, I met her in the context, there was a group of women in Paris where I was on my return from Vietnam, and I was involved with, briefly on my way home, really back to California, with a group of people who were planning a conference that was the pre-conference to the first International Women's Year for the UN in 1975. And this was a group that was trying to get together a series of proposals and so on to the official UN conference. And we were on our way to Frankfurt from Paris, and somebody introduced me to her, and we ended up spending that whole trip talking on the train and then working together in Frankfurt around getting various, basically European bourgeois feminists to adopt our resolutions. So we became friends in the course of that. And then when we got back to Paris, I spent a lot of time with her. And so I think the scene that you're describing in the book is in her apartment. Actually, the last time I saw her, when they gave me a sort of goodbye dinner. And I had asked her, why she joined the guerrilla and how she defied the torture and didn't talk. And to the first question, she said, in 1968, there was no way to struggle legally against the dictatorship. Either you joined the clandestine armed struggle or you accepted the status quo. It's true that 90% of the comrades were men. I told you that before. Most of the women who joined were like me, university students. While many of us were lovers of the men, we were not housewives. We were independent. Those of us who learned to use arms were treated as equals, as comrades. And then I asked her how she managed not to talk, because she had described some pretty gruesome torture. And she said, we had a clear analysis of the situation. If I talked, 30, 40, maybe 50 sympathizers would get hurt or killed. If I died, it would be better. I didn't think of my life as more important than 50 others. I was sure we were correct. I had no doubts. I joined the movement because I was sure it was the only way for us to live like humans. Life to me was not worth living if I couldn't fight. People who joined the movement for personal status, they were the ones who talked. So you asked about the motivation for the book, and frankly, this book was 20 years in the making. When I first started writing pieces of it, I had no idea what it would become. And so my motivations became different than, say, the last 5 years where I really focused on making it a publishable book. And I think there were two things, but I think the main motivation was a growing frustration, I guess you'd have to say, with the way that my and the experience of most of the people that I admired and worked with and struggled with, the way our experience was totally ignored in the depiction, not just of the women's movement, but really of the anti-imperialist movement. And that whenever the women's movement of the 60s and 70s was referred to, it was assumed it was a bunch of bourgeois white women, burning bras. And they might have been tactically militant of organizing clandestine abortion movements or something like that, which, I'm not knocking at all. I'm not knocking the clandestine abortion movement. But there was quite an important, for a time, anti-imperialist women's movement, which has been totally ignored in all the documentaries, films, writings, basically buried dead without a headstone is what I said in the preface to my book. So this was an attempt to resurrect that, but not just for the sake of getting the history straight, but also because I felt like a lot of what was happening today could be stronger if there were more women participating. I thought about after the first Trump inauguration, there was that huge women's demonstration. Millions of women turned out for that, wearing pussy hats and stuff like that. And yet, all they were doing was protesting Trump and Trump's words with no understanding of their potential power as anti-imperialists or the importance and the connection between having a president like Trump and the whole system. So that was part of the motivation and probably the main motivation.
It's clear that the main intervention that you're making there as you're describing it comes through, because I think a lot of times the criticism of militant forms of resistance, of militancy, whether in the context of anti-imperialism or just political struggle more generally, is that the barriers of entry for participation are really high in comparison to other forms of protest, nonviolence, like the types of mobilization that you're just describing in terms of the mass mobilizations around Trump, which get a lot of participation, but don't really achieve very much because of a lack of real sustained organizing. And I think one thing that comes through in your book is to show that those barriers for entry may be higher in terms of not everyone is going to be involved in militancy, but they're not gendered. I mean, they're only gendered in our interpretation of them. There's this like image of the male militant, but that is truly a creation of like a patriarchal narrativization. And what your work does is really to unveil that history and to show that not only can women participate in militant forms of resistance, they very much have been the whole time through. And that feels like a really important corrective, not just about the historical record, but thinking about how to motivate new forms of resistance and struggle heading into the 21st century, because certainly the challenge of cultivating meaningful anti-imperialism has not gone anywhere. So I do take that as a really important political takeaway from the history that you're telling.
Well, first of all, to define or clarify militants, I'm using the term militants in the same way that the Vietnamese Women's Union used it, or many other organizations, which basically means full-time, committed, politically organized cadre, someone who is committed organizationally and in practice to a certain, well, in this case, anti-imperialist struggle. And actually, there's another quote in the book that explains the title really in some ways better than the Sonia quote, because basically, if I wanted to be boring about the title of the book, I would have called it, "Please Organize an Anti-Imperialist Women's Organization," or something like that. And I had gone to Vietnam at the invitation of the Vietnamese Women's Union during the war, because I was involved in one of these organizations, and I had sent them a bunch of questions asking for information because I had been giving workshops about the role of women in the struggle there. And they said, "Well, we love your questions, but why don't you come here and get the answers yourself rather than just writing about it from afar." So I ended up being there, and on the day I was leaving the liberated zone in the South, I was very sad, and the woman who had been my host said this to me. She said, "Arlene, don't be sad. We are part of the worldwide family of militant women. We will meet again next time in Ho Chi Minh City, or maybe Paris, or even New York." So that's where the title of the book came from. I never thought in terms of worldwide family of militant women before I heard her say that.
Dear American friends, I am so happy as a South Vietnamese woman and mother to have the opportunity to speak to you. I convey to the American women friends my best wishes for good luck and more happiness. May I express my sincere thanks to the Women's Strike for Peace for its contribution to the anti-war movement and its sympathy and support to our people, particularly the South Vietnamese women.
I think it's significant for a number of reasons. First of all, she was a fairly high-level official, not only in the Women's Union, but in the political organization that was known as the Viet Cong in the South. And she had lost her husband, her sons, many family members, many friends, and yet she was just so vibrant, and her eyes just sparkled, and she exuded an optimism that came from the conviction that, you know, she was sure they were going to win. And so when she says we'll meet again in Ho Chi Minh City, in those days, Ho Chi Minh City was called Saigon, but, you know, they already had plans to take it over and win and rename it. And in those days, of course, the Vietnamese were not allowed to go anywhere near Paris or New York legally. I mean, from her political persuasion anyway. So the idea that they would win is conveyed in that, as well as the importance of an anti-imperialist women's movement in that struggle. So that's really where the meaning of that title for me. When I talk about these women or the worldwide family of militant women, I think it's important to emphasize that, because most people probably in the United States anyway are going to have this vision of white women. But the first anti-imperialist women in my generation were from SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And that was the leading Black liberation movement in the South, even before the Black Panther Party. Well, some people have heard of Ella Baker. She preceded SNCC, but she was one of their inspirations. But they were all very strongly anti-imperialist. In fact, SNCC was the first organization that spoke of settler colonialism as the problem inside the United States, and also the first organization to take a stance against Zionism. That was probably one of the things that destroyed them. I mean, the opposition or the hatred that came against them after that. Also, the concept of anti-imperialist women or worldwide family of militant women is rooted in a theory that I don't state explicitly in the book, but in talking about my motivation. And that's the idea that gender-based oppression is a material force. When I say gender-based oppression, I'm thinking of unwaged labor, reproducing the labor force, you know, giving birth, raising children, taking care of workers, taking care of the family. That, combined with the economic role that women have in most societies, not just women, but any gender-discriminated people, combined with the control of women's reproduction, which ends up being the source of all kinds of gendered oppression. I'm not just talking about denial of abortion. I'm talking about enforced heteronormativity. I'm talking about mass rape of Palestinian men. All these sorts of things. You cannot imagine imperialism as a success, not a successful system, as having the strength that it has without these elements. So part of the theory says that gender-based oppression serves and strengthens imperialism in ways that are essential to imperialism. And at the same time, the anti-imperialist struggle would be enormously strengthened by challenging gendered oppression. There'd be many more women involved. And women's emancipation at the same time requires the defeat of imperialism, even though it's not automatic, clearly. So that's the theory that arose from the Vietnamese Women's Union, from the Third World Women's Alliance, from some sectors of the Black Panther Party, from a lot of our experience in the 60s and 70s. And that's the theory that basically animates the book.
That's really so critically important. And I'm glad that you so nicely articulated the theoretical intervention here, because I see that interplay as so vital. The theoretical correction or intervention to offer anti-imperialism more broadly. And I think that ought to impact the programmatic demands of an anti-imperialist movement in the way that, in a similar way or analogous way that anti-imperialism as a set of programmatic demands ought to influence the struggle against capitalism and vice versa, et cetera. And yeah, I'm really glad that you brought up your exchange of letters with your comrades in Vietnam, because that really struck me as a very climactic moment in the book. A little bit later from the moment that you're talking about of your comrades' hope, but actually when you get word from those comrades in Vietnam, those women who were organizing in support of the Vietnamese resistance against the US-backed puppet regime in South Vietnam, that the war was actually going to end, that the US was in fact suffering this world historical defeat. And in reading that, it was hard not to think about comparisons to the present moment, just in terms of how quickly popular consciousness shifted in the US in the wake of October 7th, how that led to massive repression and material setbacks in the movement. And yet, empire, nevertheless, the empire finds itself once again staring down strategic defeat in its own war on Iran. And just in reading that section of your book, I think that the movement against the Vietnam War is often narrativized retrospectively as being mostly about the impact it had on veterans. But your account really, by foregrounding this communication that you're having with your comrades there, it really shows the other side, that you and those comrades were invested in the victory of America's enemies. And that felt so poignant when you go up to Canada to receive those comrades, along with members of the American Indian movement, who were there in a way representing America's original enemies, because this was their victory too. I was wondering if you could just talk about the significance of that moment of going up to receive them in Canada and just what that was felt like on the ground at the time.
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked about that, because a lot of people didn't. I think that's the first time I've been asked about that. That was May 1975. The victory had been April 30th. The victory was a very dramatic point. Well, somewhat like today, in that there had been a ceasefire in 1973 that the United States typically ignored and violated, and the fighting continued, and all kinds of atrocities happened between the time of the ceasefire and the final victory. But even before the ceasefire, the Vietnamese actually, if you date it from when they first declared independence from the French, they had been fighting imperialism, either in the form of Japanese imperialism, French colonialism, or the United States invasion for 30 years. So this wasn't quick by any means. And as far as our involvement, I had been involved in the anti-war movement since 1965, which was 10 years. So I wouldn't call it quick by any stretch of the imagination. And it spanned generations. So we had been involved for at least 10 years, some people longer than 10 years. And in the course of that 10 years, and the book tries to show this, and to get back to your original question about high bar and so on, when I first joined the anti-war movement, and I tried to show this in the book, I was quite naive and very, very much like a lot of the people who first started to pay attention to something being wrong, particularly morally wrong with the United States at the start of the Gaza genocide, and just being outraged at the atrocities. And I tried to show that in the book. And even though it was frankly very difficult for me to write so personally, what I was trying to do was talk to those people who are still in that moral outrage stage, or even frustrated stage, or just alienated, and show through what my experience was, which was typical, I think, of a lot of women in my social setting, young, lower middle class, upper working class white women, students for the most part. And so I start off very, very naive. And over the course of 10 years, I learned that the problem wasn't simply a failure of the morality of the president, or even who the president was. I mean, there's a scene in the book where I talk about how in 1963, actually, SDS, which was the radical student organization of the time, the white student organization of the time, we were trying to decide what to do in relation to the presidential election, which was between Lyndon Baines Johnson, LBJ, and Barry Goldwater, who was the spokesperson really for the Klan, and super right-wing Republican, maybe the most right-wing Republican, well, in my lifetime anyway. And he had promised he was going to bomb Vietnam into the Stone Age. Johnson, on the other hand, campaigned as a peace candidate. But he was a Southerner, and he was the one who was responsible for not allowing Fannie Lou Hamer, representing the Black Freedom Democratic Party, where, there was not even a legal right to vote for Black people. So he was on the side of the Dixiecrats. So we had a button that said part of the way with LBJ.
We are not about to send American boys 9,000 or 10,000 miles away from home to do what Asian boys ought to be doing for themselves.
And part of our organizing entailed, well, let's vote for the lesser of the evils, to use today's language. And, we did that. And then within 2 years, he had 500,000 troops on the ground in Vietnam, and he was carpet bombing, and in fact did, quote unquote, bomb Vietnam back to the Stone Age. So that lesson, after that, I had nothing to do with electoral politics, well, particularly not on a national scale. But that was a real eye-opener in terms of understanding something about the system. I mean, that was just one aspect of it. But what I'm trying to say is, so from going to a politics that was essentially liberal and reformist and very naive, of part of the way with LBJ, to a politics of ho, 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 Chi Minh and the left is going to win, bring the war home. That change in politics and slogans and so on, and understanding that the Vietnamese victory would be our victory, took about, I'd say, 2 years, maybe 3.
Wow.
Well, for me. Now, for others, it might have been a little quicker. For others, it might have been slower. But frankly, for the majority of the anti-Vietnam War movement, I don't think that ever happened. And I think it would be inaccurate to say that, the millions and millions and millions of, well, the majority of the people in the United States who turned against the war, they didn't turn against the war because they wanted the defeat of imperialism by any means. We were always a minority. So it wasn't so quick. But even, say, from 68 to 75 was quite a long struggle. There were so many times in that 8 years, say, when this is the turning point. This is the victory. Similar to today. I remember the images of the Palestinian people in Gaza dancing in the street after the announcement of the very first ceasefire, when they had the first exchange of prisoners. And that was a turning point. That was an important victory, but it wasn't the victory, obviously. And there were many points like that along the way of those years. But in terms of the scene in Canada, what happened was there was an organization of Vietnamese expats in Canada, not in the United States, who were in touch and much closer to the Vietnamese victorious side than the group in the United States. And also they had more freedom in terms of the Vietnamese were allowed to come to Canada. They couldn't set foot in the United States at that point. So we organized this sort of victory tour for them. And the last stop in that tour was going to be Vancouver for those of us who wanted to welcome them to North America on the West Coast. So that was the context of that scene. And it's very hard to convey but if you can try to imagine, the main spokesperson for the Vietnamese delegation was a veteran of the war, a soldier who had, fought actively against the United States. And he was very small. He probably was not much taller than 5'2" or something. And there were two men who were on stage with him at different points. One was the native leader in Canada who welcomed him to North America. And he was huge. And they held each other's arms up, in a victory. That was after a drum circle. And it was just a very emotional time. And everybody was crying and screaming. And I mean, these several hundred people were totally involved in the movement, as were, of course, the Vietnamese. And then at the same time, there was one of the leaders of the Vietnam Veterans Against the War. And these were guys who had fought also. There's a wonderful book that recounts a meeting they had where they testified about all their own crimes in Vietnam, called the Winter Soldier Investigation. And so these were the same people who had raped Vietnamese women, who had bombed villages to smithereens, who were responsible for untold numbers of killings. And they became anti-imperialists. So one of their spokespeople also joined the Vietnamese on the stage, and he's this also very tall, blonde, football player type looking guy, might have been prom king of his high school. Anyway, that physical type, crying his eyes out. And what the Vietnamese told us at this point was that, they had actually, their stop in Vancouver was relatively unplanned. We had organized it the last minute, and they had only planned to stay 4 hours, but they spent the whole day with us because they got so much energy from the obvious solidarity and joy at sharing this victory. I don't know if that adequately explains it, but
yeah, no, it's just incredible to hear that retelling and very visceral. I felt like I was in the room with you all. And I really appreciate your articulation of the transformation in how you personally were thinking about the charge of anti-imperialism and how that was reflected in the movement more broadly, because you started by talking about a position that you described as a form of naivete, where it was really framed around morality. The push was to get the United States to kind of wake up to its crimes and to stop doing the bad things and to start doing good things. And I do think that persists as the predominant way people think about anti-imperialism. It's not really about resistance to imperialism. It's about a kind of noblesse oblige, where the United States will just stop doing bad actions. And that's where, to me, it ties in with, you mentioned SNCC bringing in a settler colonialism analysis, right? Because I think that longer history is what helps to explain not just the amorality of American empire, but its structural compulsion towards these forms of domination. And what that analysis then leads to is actual structures of resistance, forces of resistance from beyond the empire that can lead to its demise. And that, to me, is a much more principled version of anti-imperialism. But of course, it's much harder to galvanize as a mass movement in the United States, because people, I think, like to believe that the nation itself has some redemptive arc that can wake up from the morass of its delusions about the world or something and just like all of a sudden snap to it. And I think the reality is something much tougher to confront, but just vital, that we have that kind of theoretical grounding in order to do the kind of work we need to do and form the kind of coalitions that we need to form. And I guess kind of following from that in terms of coalition forming and doing some of this work, which I think necessarily draws a lot of repression domestically to do real anti-imperialist work. I wanted to ask you about how left-wing movements it can be about Vietnam or more broadly, but how left-wing movements in the 60s and 70s developed a culture around and response to some of that repression in the form of movement security. Because a lot of your book is about these movements trying to protect themselves against various forms of violence and repression, either from the police or from the federal government. And I think movements on the left today are facing a lot of these same threats. So we've seen recently the Trump administration appears to be rolling out something like a new Red Scare program of targeting dissent through surveillance, prosecutions, various terrorism designation schemes. And so those questions around movement security are as relevant as ever.
Yeah. It's easy to get into, number one, despair. But one of the things that the Black Panther Party used to say was, the man doesn't have us outgunned, he has us out-organized. Well, actually, he had us outgunned and out-organized. And that's probably truer today than it was then. But the point, it's really an adaptation of something Mao Zedong wrote about, which is that to build any kind of effective resistance to repression, you need mass support. And I think that it's easy to get into a mode of, well, let's find the right application that they're not going to be able to tap into, or what kind of foreign cell phone can you buy, or that sort of thing. And I'm not saying that shouldn't be done. I'm just saying that without more mass support and commitment to the same politics that we have, it doesn't matter. What we really, really need, our best protection, is that. And I think, in fact, the whole new, I don't like calling it the Red Scare, because who's scared? People who were my teachers who survived the Red Scare were not scared. And they weren't particularly scary people. And I feel like calling it the Red Scare contributes to the idea that, these are terrorists, these are people to be afraid of. No, we're not. It puts us on the defensive immediately. But the state is going to be repressive, including all its apparatus, as soon as they feel threatened. And they obviously feel threatened now, for good reason. The economy is in shambles. Iran is winning. They're way overextended. The economy can't survive without war, but it can't survive without perpetual war, but it can't survive with perpetual war. So they have good reason to be frightened, but we do not have enough mass support in terms of understanding what the task is and what we can do to hasten the defeat of this empire. And, I look at the people, for example, celebrating the victory of, forgetting his name, the Egyptian descendant who just won the primary.
Abdullah Sayed.
Right. So you hear people say on CNN, well, I voted for him because I would never vote for anyone supported by AIPAC. In other words, the people who voted for him may be misplacing their faith in this electoral gesture, but they did so for good motivations. And it's our job to go organize these people and find ways to address their concerns so that they will become more active in the struggle and also have vehicles in which they can be more active. So I feel like that's the main protection in terms of security, to have more and more people actively on our side. Because there's something I discussed a little bit in the book, which was what we came to know as the, quote, military era and security culture, where the organization becomes more and more secretive and more insulated and isolated. And that's actually is the motivation of people like Rubio, is in fact to force us into a corner, whether it's a legalistic corner, putting all our resources to battling in court, or it's a secretive corner, or a frightened corner. So I don't have any specific techniques or technical solutions to the problem, particularly not technical solutions, because the level of surveillance and technology that they have these days was unimaginable in our day. However, I think it is important to remember the Vietnamese actually, they were overwhelmed technologically by U.S. bombers, and the United States, I forget what they called it. There was some U.S. technology that was supposedly sort of the equivalent to the drone surveillance in those days, where there was some kind of sensor that they used to detect human heat, because the guerrillas would hide in the jungles and they couldn't find them, so they defoliated the jungles and that sort of thing. So what the Vietnamese did would be they would hang urine in trees so that these detectors would think there were guerrillas there, and they would be long gone. And the point is that there's always a way to deceive if you have a lot of people on your side, particularly. And so the main message, I think, is that our security depends on becoming much more embedded in the population.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I'm really hearing the theme of solidarity kind of come to the surface here as the best defense against repression. And I think that the challenge that raises is how to cultivate a sense of solidarity between different parts of the movement. Because I think I agree with you that the tactic of repression is to try and atomize and isolate people. And often that takes the form of isolating people from one another and sowing mutual distrust. And that, I think, was a key part of the domestic counterinsurgency operations from the 60s and 70s and remains the case today. And so I guess the challenge or the question that comes up to mind for me, and it's not like we have really a very robust underground in the United States today if we think about what's happening at the grassroots level. But I don't think it's crazy to imagine that such a thing could develop again in this country, especially as you named some of these crises around the economy and the climate and some of the geopolitical crises continue to devolve. And I'm wondering if you have any guidance or lessons to impart about how to sustain solidarity between different parts of the movement, between the above ground and the underground, to make sure that that basis of support, that collective self-defense, remains part of our movement infrastructure and can help defend everyone against the forces of repression.
I think the main thing is the political connection. I mean, to get back to the word solidarity, it's a cliche, solidarity is not charity. Mm. And again, the slogan, your victory is our victory, their victory is our victory. If you don't understand what stake you have as an individual in building a different kind of humane system, that's always primary. Mm. So, like you mentioned, climate catastrophe. If you care about having a livable planet for your grandchildren, you're going to join an anti-ICE demonstration, because currently ICE is the military representation of imperialism inside the United States. And to the extent you can weaken ICE's repression ICE imposes on vast communities, you're contributing to avoiding climate catastrophe or lessening climate catastrophe, because I think we're beyond the point of no return at this point. But in other words, solidarity has to be rooted in a political understanding of how the issues that you care about, or how it's not just issues you care about that are external to you, but how you understand your survival being connected to other people's survival. So, look at the latest case with this deportation of the people from Haiti. I was just reading today about Mondani apologize, some rather weak apology as far as I can see, for firing all the Haitians who were being deported because they're in city employment in New York. And he's saying, oh, well, we have no choice. It's the federal government. Well, you fucking have choice. Mm. You always have a choice. It may not be the best of choice. It may not be, quote, legal choice, but fascism has to be resisted if anyone is going to survive. Now, I'm not pinning it on Mondani. There should be a very, very strong movement on the ground in Brooklyn, the heart of the Haitian community, as well as the other boroughs, to say, no, you're not going to fire these people. There are co-workers and there are people who our lives depend on, not only because 20 years from now imperialism may die, but because they take care of us.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you brought that up, because I did want to kind of in our final portion of this conversation talk about those front lines of state violence. And I agree that that is a version of imperialism that is transpiring on the home front beyond just state repression in terms of legal procedures, but actual extrajudicial violence that is being waged on people in our own communities. And in 2013, you authored a report, Operation Ghetto Storm, which detailed the 313 extrajudicial killings of Black people in the United States by cops, security guards, and vigilantes in the year prior. Just thinking back to that moment, like many people in my generation, the murder of Trayvon Martin was hugely impactful as a political moment. And the subsequent uprisings against police violence that followed in 2014 in Ferguson, Missouri, after Michael Brown was killed, and then the George Floyd movement in 2020, felt like moments or possibilities of profound political rupture. At the same time, though, these movements seem to have faded away a bit just as quickly as they've emerged. And where there have been advances on the organized left, those seem to have come at the cost of abolition or even defunding the police. You bring up Mamdani, who was elected on the back of all of this popular energy on the left. And, in many ways, he has advanced some of his projects, but he seems to have done almost nothing in terms of touching the police. So I do think that poses a vital contradiction. On the other hand, though, if we are kind of surveying the political landscape, we are seeing that extrajudicial killings from ICE and DHS agents have mobilized a large number of people during the second Trump administration. So I just would love to hear your thoughts on if you think that that particular nexus of direct state violence will continue to be a central site of struggle on the left. Do you think it's vital that we keep organizing, particularly on that terrain?
You mentioned the report Operation Ghetto Storm. I wanted to start my answer by explaining the title because I think it says a lot politically. The way the report happened was I was talking to a comrade of mine, Kali Akuno, actually, who I had worked with in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. And he was talking about Trayvon Martin killing. And this was at the very early stages of that campaign where, for people who may not know anymore, because it's more than 10 years ago, memories are short. Trayvon Martin was a young black man, went to the store for Skittles in some Florida housing complex. And this white guy, George Zimmerman, who was sort of a self-appointed vigilante, decided he was threatening him because, of course, this young black kid eating Skittles is very threatening. And he ended up murdering him. And there was a huge campaign to get Zimmerman, firstly, arrested. They took a long time to arrest him and then to try him and convict him. And this was really the spark of the whole Black Lives Matter movement. But the Black Lives Matter movement took a while to germinate. And so I was talking to Kali about this, and, you know, it's sort of every mother's nightmare that they send their kid to the store for whatever, and they don't come home. And I certainly felt that. I have two black sons. I was talking to Kali about how this seems to be systematic and part of the racist system and so on. And so I asked him, you know, has anybody collected any data on this? And as far as he knew, nobody had. And so I started, I'm retired and I had the time. I started collecting data, and that's how the report started. But the more and more data I collected, and I found that a black person is killed by a cop or a vigilante sponsored by the state every 28 hours. And not only that were they killing, but they were killing for no reason and with impunity. And as I was reading about the police in general, they had had a convention a year or two before the Trayvon Martin killing where they were selling T-shirts, and their T-shirts had the slogan Operation Ghetto Storm on it, which was a takeoff on Operation Desert Storm. Operation Desert Storm was the first invasion of Iraq by U.S. troops. So the point is that the National Police Convention knew that they were playing essentially the same role in black communities as U.S. troops in Iraq were. That is, they were an invading force trying to subdue and enforce U.S. colonial or neo-colonial or internal colonial rule on black people inside the United States. They were explicit about it. Mm-hmm. And in the report, we have some quotes like that. So that's the title. And the data, it's mainly a collection of charts, the report, that show how most of the killings happened with the justification that the police felt threatened. I mean, totally subjective, no evidence, and with virtual impunity. So that's what the data showed, and that's where our analysis went. And it wasn't a particularly new analysis. I mean, SNCC and the Black Panther Party and all the political prisoners understood the state as the enemy and the police not really different from an invading army.
In America, black people are treated very much as the Vietnamese people or any other colonized people, because we're brutalized. The police in our community occupy our area, our community, as a foreign troop occupies territory. And the police are there not to, in our community, not to promote our welfare or for our security and our safety, but they're there to contain us, to brutalize us and murder us because they have their orders to do so.
Certainly not there to protect people, as they may be in white communities, or particularly upper middle class white communities. Unfortunately, the main demands of Black Lives Matter movement and Trayvon and George Floyd, etc., were for justice, quote unquote, which usually meant prison for the cops, for the individual cop. Let's convict the cop of murder, and or money for the families of the murdered children. Now, I'm not trying to say that those families don't deserve compensation and the cops don't deserve prison. But even if in some cases they got the money or the prison terms, it wouldn't make any difference. And certainly not training, body cameras, all the tinkering that's been done to supposedly remedy this problem. None of that has helped. And it's clear it hasn't helped. The data hasn't changed at all. It's probably gotten worse, although very few people are keeping track these days. But in other words, the bottom line is the court system, and I know you're a lawyer, so I apologize, but I don't think the court system is the place to find justice, because the courts are mainly designed to protect the system. And I certainly empathize with the mothers, but I don't believe that tinkering or individual restitution changes the issue at all. And the other thing that the report showed, but unfortunately people in the movement didn't pay much attention to, is the issue of whether the people who were murdered were armed or not. And I ended up writing an article, which people could find on my website, actually, called "What If Michael Brown Was Armed?" Because it almost became like Michael Brown's first name was Unarmed. Unarmed Michael Brown was shot down, da-da-da. So it was like, it would have been okay to shoot him if he was armed. Meanwhile, you have hundreds of thousands of white militia armed, marching everywhere. Mm-hmm. In other words, carrying a gun is not a crime in this ridiculous country. But somehow, if you're Black and carrying a gun, it's a huge crime. It's because, in fact, the state considers this a challenge to their authority, and that's not tolerated. So we have a similar thing happening with some of the ICE protests, not all of it, but some of it is, why are they stopping this immigrant? He has papers. Or look, they're stopping that woman and she's actually a Native American. In other words, it would be okay to stop people and capture them in the middle of their day if they were, in fact, so-called here illegally, without contesting the fundamental issue of citizenship and why there are so many people who've been forced to migrate here and who are sustaining the U.S. economy in a lot of ways. So again, I feel like looking at a social problem from a systemic point of view of what function the police violence plays and what function the ICE violence plays, there are a lot of parallels there for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess I need to start off and just address the lawyer comment because I will say in my own defense, I am a movement defense attorney, and I fully agree with you that no liberation will be found in the courtroom, and that is not a site of political progression. You have my support there. Yeah, and I really appreciate your comments on this about, I think, on the one hand, the potential of these movements, but on the real need for a systemic analysis of the role this violence plays in supporting empire domestically. Because if I look out on the political landscape today, I think there is much to be enthusiastic about in terms of some of the profound transformations we've seen in popular consciousness around anti-imperialism, which I think has motivated a lot of the gains in the left electoral sphere. People are really, like you said with Abdullah Sayed, right? People are voting for him out of a rejection of AIPAC and of the US-Israel relationship. People have this kind of aversion to that and a sense that there is something structurally wrong with our foreign policy being determined by those relationships. But then on the other hand, we are seeing retrenchment from some of the high points in terms of popular consciousness of 2020, where those same electeds, even associated with socialist organizations, are disavowing some of the more anti-policing, abolitionist commitments that some of those organizations were making, some of those same candidates were making just a few years ago. And that to me is a profound limitation and a profound challenge. What good is advancing a properly anti-imperialist analytic on the global stage if we are not willing to recognize it at home and are not willing to challenge those structures of policing except by kind of nibbling around the edges with reforms that in some instances don't even happen. So yeah, I don't know if you have any other further thoughts on why that issue or how that issue is so vital in terms of making meaningful political change here domestically.
Well, people seem to have a lot of faith in the system as it is. And somehow it's just this horrible precedent that we have right now that's the issue. But, most of the genocide happened under Biden.
Yeah.
And the Democratic Party continues to be very pro-Zionist. But I think that even if you look at the pandemic, I happen to have a master's in public health, and I never got COVID because I understood, in fact, how to prevent myself from getting it. And there are public health measures, but they require public health, social health, rules. And neither Biden nor Trump were willing to impose that sort of thing. And now they're trying to imprison 85-year-old Dr. Fauci, who wasn't even really that clear or militant in favor of public health, but for the little whining he did about public health. So, in other words, in public health, you cannot focus on, well, I'm not sick, so I'll do what I want. And no concept that everybody is at risk if one person is at risk. And in fact, if you really want to understand solidarity, you have to look at the way countries like China and Cuba dealt with their COVID epidemics and how much more effective they were when they were, well, particularly Cuba wasn't allowed to be at some point because they couldn't get syringes. But the point is that the individualism, the profit motive, that at this point, profit in this country and the whole economic system rests on war, period. I mean, death.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And this country has not been at peace since the World War I and World War II years. Other than that, it's been one invasion and 800 military bases around the world. So it's impossible to find a solution to this problem within the context of a system of rules and regulations and institutions that are set up to defend them.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that the task of undoing those institutions and rules, of creating a political movement that can transcend that can undo the war machine and create a more just world, is something that is bigger than you, bigger than me, bigger than any of us. And I think that the most that we can hope to do is meaningfully contribute to that project with our lives. And I mean, I'm just very honored to have you on our show and to be able to speak with you, because you really have made that contribution and I think are a model for many of us in terms of contributing our lives to that cause. And I guess I just wanted to close by asking you about how you think about the future. I mean, you have 2 children. Obviously, as we've been discussing, this political project, the challenges we face are long ones, and to do them correctly, to build the world that we want to see, it will take intergenerational struggle. And, you mentioned that there's the temptation of despair. You mentioned the force of optimism as well. So I don't know if you have any just kind of final reflections or thoughts about how you view the broader intergenerational arc of struggle.
Well, I also have a granddaughter now. She's going on 3. We have no choice. We have to, those of us who are parents and grandparents or aunties and uncles, we need to think about raising the next generation of warriors, basically. I mean, the Palestinians form a model of that. And I hate to, I don't like to contradict you, but, I'm not special. And I think, just to backtrack a second from my book, I opened with a scene that was very painful to write of me having sex for the first time. And the reason why I did that way was because I hoped that if I showed what a naive, vulnerable person I was, an experience that a lot of women have, they would identify with me and then come along with me for the rest of the ride. Mm. And I don't feel exceptional at all. I never thought of myself as exceptional, just human, and having human feelings and translating those feelings somehow into action. And I think that's what we need to do, is to give our children and our grandchildren the information and the strength to continue that struggle, but not necessarily as individuals. And, I think this is an advantage that parents have in community organizing that maybe other folks don't quite have, because, it takes a village. You need collective childcare, communal childcare, cooperative childcare. Nobody can afford, well, most of the people who would become anti-imperialists can't afford paid childcare. So you get together with other people for childcare. You get together with other people for soccer teams, for children's soccer teams. I'm talking about, not FIFA. You get together with other parents, for whatever, children's carpools, whatever. And in the course of that, we help each other share the strengths that we have and the understandings we have, and we teach it to our children. I mean, I approach raising my kids like a political project. I don't want to end on that note.
You don't want to end on that note?
Well, I don't know.
I mean, I don't know. That feels very meaningful to me and is really inspiring. And I take your correction. I don't think you're exceptional, but I do think that you are a model. And I think that you have a lot to teach people. And we, people in my generation, can learn a lot of those lessons of lifelong commitment and humility and compassion and strength. So I'm really grateful for you sharing all of that in your book, in this conversation, and in everything that you do.
Thank you.